Most people believe attraction is something you create by doing the right things. Saying the right words. Choosing the right moment. Applying the right strategy. But the longer I studied human behavior, the clearer it became. Attraction rarely begins with action. It begins with absence of need. What confuses many people is the timing. They notice that when they stop chasing, when they stop explaining themselves, when they stop trying to be seen or validated, something unexpected happens. The other person begins to move closer. Not immediately. Not dramatically. But unmistakably. A message appears. Interest resurfaces. The desire to return emerges. This is often misinterpreted as a trick. As if distance itself were the cause. It isn't. Distance only reveals something deeper. In Stoic philosophy, attraction was never treated as a goal. It was understood as a byproduct of alignment. When a person is internally ordered, they stop pulling on the world for confirmation. They stop leaning. And the moment you stop leaning, the dynamic changes. I've seen this pattern repeat across centuries. In ancient Rome, men were not taught how to persuade affection. They were taught how to govern themselves. Self-command was considered magnetic. Not because it impressed others, but because it removed pressure from every interaction. Modern culture reverses this. It teaches people to optimize behavior, instead of stabilizing identity. The result is effort without gravity. What most people don't realize is that desire rarely responds to pursuit. It responds to grounded presence. To someone who does not need the outcome. To feel complete. Stoicism understood this clearly. A person who has found themselves is no longer negotiating their worth in every interaction. They are not withholding. They are not performing. They are simply there. And that presence creates space. The desire to return does not appear because you vanished. It appears because, in your absence, pressure disappeared. And in that space, clarity emerges. This audiobook is not about how to make someone come back. It's about why they do. When you stop abandoning yourself. Because attraction is not something you manufacture. It is something that reappears. When the architecture of your inner life becomes stable. From here, we will move carefully. Through ancient philosophy. Through observation. Through structure. Not to teach you how to pull someone closer. But to show you why. When you stand firmly in yourself, others stop drifting away. Attraction has always been misunderstood. Most people believe it is created through effort. Through correct timing, correct words, correct behavior. They assume that if they do enough, say enough, adjust enough, desire will eventually respond. But history suggests otherwise. The more closely I studied human relationships, ancient and modern, the clearer it became that attraction rarely grows under pressure. It emerges when pressure disappears. In ancient philosophy, attraction was never treated as a technique. It was not something to be induced or engineered. It was observed as a reaction to inner order. The Stoics, in particular, paid little attention to persuasion. They were far more concerned with self-governance. A person who could not govern themselves, they believed, would inevitably attempt to govern others. Through control, through need, through insistence. And that attempt was always felt. In Roman society, this understanding was practical rather than romantic. Men were not taught how to win affection. They were taught how to stand firmly within their role. Status was not displayed through assertion, but through composure. A man who was centered did not pursue validation. He did not rush toward outcomes. He did not negotiate his worth. And because of that, he carried gravity. Modern culture has inverted this logic. Today, People are taught to perform connection rather than embody it. They are trained to optimize reactions instead of stabilizing presence. As a result, attraction becomes effortful. And effort, when perceived, dissolves desire. I began to notice a recurring pattern. When a person is internally unsettled, they lean forward. They seek reassurance. They seek clarity from the outside. They attempt to resolve uncertainty through proximity. This leaning creates tension. Not emotional tension. Structural tension. Stoicism understood this clearly. Need creates imbalance. Imbalance creates resistance. Not consciously, but instinctively. Desire retreats from pressure. The same way the body retreats from force. What most people miss is that attraction does not respond to absence alone. It responds to the quality of presence that remains when need dissolves. Distance without inner stability changes nothing. Silence without self-command creates confusion, not desire. The ancient world recognized this difference. Withdrawal was not strategic. It was a byproduct of inner completeness. A person did not step back to provoke interest. They stepped back because they no longer required reassurance. This is why the desire to return appears after self-alignment. Not before it. When someone finds themselves. When they stop negotiating identity through reaction. The relational dynamic shifts automatically. Pressure disappears. Expectations dissolve. Space returns. And in that space, desire can breathe. Modern advice often misinterprets this phenomenon. It reduces it to tactics. Pull back. Create scarcity. Disappear. But these are imitations of a deeper transformation. Without inner order, distance feels manipulative. With inner order, distance feels neutral. And neutrality is magnetic. Stoicism never taught indifference as a strategy. It taught indifference as a consequence of self-mastery. A Stoic did not suppress emotion. They refused to be governed by it. This distinction is critical. When someone is governed by longing, their actions accelerate. They explain. They clarify. They seek closure. All of this communicates the same message. I am unsettled. Attraction responds to settlement. To someone who is no longer in motion internally. A person who has found themselves does not seek to be chosen. They are already chosen. By their own alignment. I saw this pattern repeated in countless modern interactions. When individuals stopped organizing their behavior around outcomes, relationships reorganized themselves. Not always toward reunion. Not always toward continuation. But always toward clarity. And clarity often precedes return. The desire to return is not nostalgia. It is recognition. Recognition of a shift in structure. When someone senses that you no longer require them to complete yourself, the entire emotional field changes. Ancient philosophy never promised reunion. It promised freedom from dependence. And paradoxically, freedom from dependence is what allows desire to reappear naturally. This is why attraction cannot be pursued directly. The moment it becomes the goal, inner alignment is compromised. The Stoics were explicit about this. They taught that one must focus on what is within control. Character, judgment, self-command. And release what is not. Desire, by definition, belongs to the other. Once this principle is understood, many modern anxieties dissolve. Questions shift. Not, how do I make them want me? But, why do I need them to want me? In order to feel whole. This question is uncomfortable. It forces confrontation with inner instability. But without this confrontation, attraction remains elusive. The desire to return does not emerge because someone was manipulated into missing you. It emerges when the dynamic no longer demands anything from them. When interaction becomes optional rather than urgent. Stoicism calls this state autarkia. Self-sufficiency. Not isolation. Not detachment. But inner completeness. A person who possesses this quality does not withdraw from connection. They simply stop chasing it. And when chasing ends, something ancient and reliable occurs. Desire reorients. Not because of distance, but because pressure has vanished. This is the foundation upon which attraction rests. Not technique. Not timing. Not performance. But architecture. The architecture of a self that stands without leaning. Once this architecture is in place, relationships change without instruction. Some dissolve. Some stabilize. Some return. But all become honest. And honesty is the beginning of true attraction. This is where the work begins. Not with others, but with the structure of the self. Because attraction does not follow effort. It follows alignment. Most people believe that attraction disappears because something was done wrong. A wrong phrase. A wrong decision. A wrong moment. They assume that if they could identify the mistake, they could reverse the outcome. But this way of thinking misses the real cause. Attraction rarely fades because of one action. It fades because of a gradual loss of inner position. I noticed that before attraction weakens, something else always happens first. A person begins to monitor themselves. They watch how they are perceived. They adjust their tone. They anticipate reactions. Their attention slowly shifts outward. This shift is subtle, but decisive. Stoic philosophers describe this as the moment a person abandons their center. Not dramatically. Not consciously. But through small concessions. They stop standing where they are. And begin leaning toward response. Leaning changes everything. A person who leans is no longer present. They are reaching. And reaching is felt, even when unspoken. Ancient thinkers understood that attraction does not respond to desire itself, but to how desire is held. Desire contained remains invisible. Desire leaked becomes pressure. Modern culture encourages leaking. Express everything. Clarify everything. Resolve everything immediately. But urgency is rarely attractive. Urgency communicates instability. Stoicism offered a different model. Not suppression. Not withdrawal. But containment. A contained person experiences emotion fully. Without outsourcing it. They do not require response in order to stabilize themselves. I observed that when people lose attraction, they often try to fix it by increasing effort. They explain more. They initiate more. They attempt to close distance through proximity. This almost always accelerates decline. Not because closeness is wrong, but because closeness mixed with need dissolves polarity. Polarity requires two stable points. When one point begins to move excessively, balance collapses. The Stoics believed that stability was the foundation of all human interaction. A person who could remain internally still was considered powerful. Not dominant. Stable. Modern advice often misunderstands this. It frames stability as indifference. Or emotional unavailability. But Stoic stability is neither. It is self-command. The ability to remain oneself. Regardless of outcome. When someone lacks this self-command, their behavior becomes reactive. They respond to tone shifts. They chase reassurance. They attempt to restore certainty. Each reaction reduces presence. Presence is not something you project. It is something you retain. And it is retained through inner independence. Inner independence does not mean you do not care. It means your sense of self does not rise and fall with external feedback. The Stoics considered this non-negotiable. I noticed that people who regained attraction did not change tactics. They changed orientation. They stopped seeking confirmation and returned to themselves. This return is not visible at first. It happens internally. A person stops waiting for response to decide how they feel. They stop asking, "What does this mean about me?" and begin acting from a fixed position. Once this happens, communication changes. Messages become shorter. Silence becomes tolerable. Waiting no longer feels threatening. Not because hope is gone, but because self-respect has returned. The desire to return often appears here. Not because of distance, but because pressure has ended. Pressure is not created by words. It is created by need. Ancient philosophy was clear on this. You cannot persuade desire. You can only remove what repels it. Repulsion does not come from honesty. It comes from dependence. When someone feels responsible for your emotional equilibrium, desire withdraws. Stoicism teaches that no one should be burdened with stabilizing another person. This is not cruelty. It is respect. I realize that many people chase attraction by abandoning their boundaries. They become more agreeable, more available, more accommodating. But accommodation without grounding communicates insecurity. The Stoics warned against this explicitly. They believed that self-betrayal, even in the name of harmony, corrodes dignity. And dignity is attractive. When dignity returns, behavior simplifies. There is less explanation, less urgency, less emotional negotiation. Interaction becomes optional, not necessary. Optionality changes dynamics. When connection is optional, it can be chosen freely. When it is necessary, it becomes heavy. This is why the desire to return feels sudden. Nothing new was added. Something was removed. The removal of need restores balance. Balance invites approach. Attraction does not respond to effort. It responds to self-possession. This is not something you perform. It is something you stop violating. Once self-possession is restored, relationships recalibrate naturally. Some end. Some continue. Some return. But none remain distorted. Stoicism never promised reunion. It promised alignment. And alignment, when sustained, creates conditions where desire can exist without force. This is the real beginning. Not of attraction, but of sovereignty. There is a moment most people never notice. A moment when attraction does not disappear suddenly, but quietly loses depth. Nothing dramatic happens. No argument. No final conversation. Just a subtle change in tone. I began to recognize this moment clearly. It always arrived after one thing. Self-abandonment. Not abandonment of the other, but abandonment of oneself. A person begins to act against their own internal signal. They say yes when they feel no. They remain available when they feel drained. They continue engagement when something inside has already withdrawn. This dissonance is not visible immediately, but it is felt. Stoic philosophy treated this as a serious error. Not morally, but structurally. When actions no longer align with inner judgment, a fracture forms. An attraction cannot survive fracture. Modern culture often encourages endurance. Be patient. Be understanding. Don't give up too easily. These ideas sound noble. But endurance without alignment creates quiet resentment. And resentment leaks. I noticed that attraction weakens not when conflict appears, but when a person repeatedly overrides themselves to preserve connection. This override accumulates. It erodes self-respect. Stoics believed that self-respect was non-transferable. You could not receive it from another person. You could only preserve it through consistency. Once lost, it could not be replaced with reassurance. When self-respect erodes, behavior changes. The voice softens unnaturally. Boundaries blur. Presence thins. The person becomes agreeable, but less grounded. Attraction does not respond to agreeableness. It responds to clarity. Clarity requires alignment between thought, emotion, and action. Ancient thinkers believed that every human interaction reveals inner order. Not through words, but through posture, timing, and restraint. A person who is aligned does not rush to maintain connection. They allow connection to respond. Modern relationships often reverse this. People chase continuity instead of coherence. They try to keep something alive, even when it no longer reflects who they are. This effort creates tension. Stoicism insisted that a person should never remain where they must diminish themselves to belong. This was not pride. It was structural wisdom. I observed that when individuals stopped overriding themselves, something unexpected happened. They did not become colder. They became quieter. They spoke only when it felt true. They paused when unsure. They allowed space without anxiety. This shift often felt risky. Silence exposed uncertainty. Stillness removed distraction. But it also restored integrity. Integrity changes how a person is perceived. Not consciously. Instinctively. A person who is no longer fragmented feels heavier. More real. I realized that attraction rarely ends because someone loses interest. It ends because someone loses coherence. They remain present physically, but absent internally. The other person senses this absence. Stoic philosophy warned against this state. They believed that presence without alignment was worse than absence with dignity. This explains why stepping back sometimes restores attraction. Not because distance creates mystery, but because it restores coherence. A person returns to themselves. Returning to oneself is not dramatic. It is often uncomfortable. It involves accepting that certain dynamics no longer fit. It involves tolerating loss of connection, rather than loss of self. The Stoics believed this tolerance was essential. A person who could not tolerate loss would sacrifice themselves to avoid it. And self-sacrifice, when unconscious, destroys attraction. I noticed that once people chose self-alignment over reassurance, their emotional state stabilized. They no longer scanned for signals. They no longer interpreted every delay. Their attention returned inward. This inward return does not isolate. It grounds. Grounded people do not cling. They invite. Attraction responds to invitation, not obligation. Modern advice often treats boundaries as tactics. The Stoics treated them as consequences. A boundary was not set to control others. It emerged naturally. When a person stopped betraying themselves. This is why attraction sometimes reappears. Without any direct action. Nothing was done to the other. Everything was corrected internally. Correction restores symmetry. Symmetry restores balance. Balance invites movement. The desire to return is often the desire to re-enter a space that feels ordered. A space where no one is leaning. Stoicism teaches that you should never remain Where your presence requires explanation. When you are aligned, your presence explains itself. This does not guarantee reunion. It guarantees dignity. And dignity is the only foundation upon which attraction can exist without force. When dignity is restored, outcomes become secondary. Whether someone returns or not, the person no longer loses themselves. This is the turning point. Not because attraction is secured, but because self-betrayal has ended. And once self-betrayal ends, whatever follows is real. There is a quiet shift that happens when a person stops acting from lack. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. But it changes everything. I noticed that once self-betrayal ends, a person's relationship with time changes. They no longer rush. They are no longer haunted by delays, pauses, or unanswered questions. Time stops feeling like an enemy. Stoic philosophy treated this shift as essential. They believed that impatience was not a personality trait, but a signal of inner dependence. A person who needs outcomes to arrive quickly is not free. Modern culture confuses urgency with care. If you care, you act immediately. If you wait, you risk losing something. The Stoics rejected this logic entirely. They believed that what is real does not require pursuit. Waiting, in their view, was not passivity. It was strength. The ability to remain steady, while life unfolded on its own terms. I observed that people who regained attraction often did nothing outwardly impressive. They did not provoke. They did not perform absence. They did not make statements. They simply stopped interfering. Interference is subtle. It appears as checking, as clarifying, as ensuring nothing is misunderstood. But interference signals fear. Fear contracts presence. A fearful presence feels narrow. An attraction requires space. Stoicism understood space as psychological distance, not physical distance. A person could be close, without collapsing inward, or distant, without withdrawing emotionally. This balance is rare. Most people oscillate. They either lean too far in, or retreat too far out. Both are reactions. A person who has regained inner position does neither. They remain where they are. This stillness is often misread, but it is felt correctly. I realize that attraction does not return because someone notices effort has stopped. It returns because the field has changed. The emotional atmosphere is no longer tense. No one is being pulled. Stoic thinkers believed that relationships should never feel heavy. If they did, something was misaligned. This is why self-sufficiency mattered so much to them. Not as isolation, but as weightlessness. A person who is self-sufficient does not burden others with their equilibrium. When that burden disappears, interaction becomes lighter. Lighter interactions invite return. I noticed that people often confuse lightness with indifference. But lightness is not cold. It is calm. Calm does not demand. Calm allows. This allowance gives others freedom. Freedom to approach. Freedom to retreat. Freedom to choose. Desire only exists where choice is real. The Stoics believed that desire cannot be negotiated. It can only be permitted. And permission requires non-attachment. Non-attachment does not mean you do not care. It means you do not cling. Clinging distorts perception. A clinging person interprets everything personally. Silence becomes rejection. Delay becomes threat. This interpretation fuels reaction. When reaction stops, interpretation softens. Events are seen as they are, not as verdicts. I saw that when people reached this point, they became internally quieter. Not numb. Clear. They no longer rehearsed conversations in advance. They no longer anticipated outcomes. They responded only to what actually happened. This presence is rare. And rarity attracts. Attraction does not seek perfection. It seeks stability. The Stoics understood that stability was contagious. A stable person calms the environment around them. Not intentionally. Naturally. This calm invites return. Because it offers relief. Relief from tension. Relief from expectation. The desire to return often arises when someone remembers how it feels to be around a person who is not pulling. This is why forcing distance never works. Distance without calm is absence. Calm with proximity is presence. Stoicism aimed to cultivate this calm. Not to manipulate outcomes, but to restore order within the self. Once order is restored, relationships reorganize themselves. Without instruction. Without strategy. This is the quiet power of non-need. It does not chase. It does not withdraw. It simply remains. And in remaining, it becomes a place others recognize. A place they may choose to return to. At some point, a person begins to notice something unexpected. They are no longer waiting. Not because hope has disappeared, but because their inner life no longer revolves around an outcome. This is a subtle but decisive shift. Stoic philosophy treated this state as maturity. A mature person does not orient their emotions around anticipation. They live from position, not projection. Projection imagines futures. Position inhabits the present. I noticed that when people reached this point, their sense of self stabilized. They no longer defined themselves through reaction. They did not ask, "What does this mean about me?" They asked, "What is actually happening?" This change sounds small, but it alters everything. A person who no longer interprets events as verdicts stops internal drama. And drama, even when silent, disturbs presence. The Stoics believed that peace was not the absence of feeling, but the absence of unnecessary interpretation. Feeling passes. Interpretation lingers. Modern culture encourages constant interpretation. Every pause must mean something. Every delay must be decoded. This exhausts attention and weakens self-trust. When interpretation stops, attention returns inward. A person begins to feel grounded without needing confirmation. This grounding is not confidence. It is familiarity with oneself. I saw that attraction often reappeared after this internal familiarity returned. Not because the person became impressive, but because they became uncomplicated. Uncomplicated people are rare. They do not require others to carry their emotional weight. They do not seek resolution in conversation for conflicts that belong internally. Stoicism emphasized this distinction. Some conflicts exist in the world. Others exist only in interpretation. Wisdom meant knowing the difference. A person who knows the difference does not rush to resolve everything. They allow clarity to emerge on its own. This patience changes relational dynamics. I noticed that when patience replaced urgency, communication became simpler. Words were fewer. Silence was neutral. Neither carried hidden demand. Attraction responds to this neutrality. Because neutrality restores choice. Choice is essential. Desire cannot exist where choice is constrained by emotional pressure. The Stoics believed that freedom was the highest form of respect. To free another from emotional obligation was considered an act of dignity. This dignity is felt It does not need to be stated. I realize that many people sabotage attraction by seeking reassurance too quickly. They treat discomfort as a problem to be solved, rather than a state to be endured. Endurance was central to Stoic thought. Not endurance of pain, but endurance of uncertainty. A person who can endure uncertainty without collapsing inward becomes stable. Stability simplifies life. It removes the need to control outcomes. And when control is released, interaction breathes. This is where attraction finds space again. Not through effort, but through relief. Relief from pressure. Relief from interpretation. Relief from emotional demand. The desire to return often emerges here. Not as urgency, but as curiosity. Curiosity is lighter than need. And lightness invites approach. This is not something you force. It happens when you stop interfering with your own inner balance. Stoicism never promised certainty. It promised steadiness. And steadiness, over time, creates conditions where attraction can exist without distortion. When this steadiness is reached, outcomes no longer define identity. They become events, not judgments. This is where self-possession becomes visible. Not loudly, quietly. And quiet strength is always felt. There comes a point when a person realizes that attraction was never the real question. The real question was control. Not control over others, but control over one's own inner state. Stoic philosophy was uncompromising on this point. They believed that the moment you try to manage how another person feels, you have already lost command of yourself. This loss is subtle. It disguises itself as care, concern, or intention. But beneath it lies fear. Fear that without influence, nothing will happen. Fear that without effort, connection will disappear. The Stoics considered this fear the root of dependence. I noticed that when people released the need to influence outcomes, their inner world simplified. They stopped planning emotional strategies. They stopped rehearsing conversations. They stopped positioning themselves for reactions. Their attention returned to what they could actually govern. This return created a shift in energy. Not excitement. Not indifference. Authority. Authority is often misunderstood. It is not dominance. It is not assertion. It is the absence of inner debate. A person with authority does not argue with themselves about how they should be perceived. Stoicism aimed directly at this state. They taught that a person should act from judgment, not from desire for response. Once judgment is clear, action becomes simple. I observed that attraction often responded to this simplicity. When behavior was no longer shaped by anticipation, it became cleaner. No hidden intent. No emotional leverage. Just presence. Presence without agenda is rare. Most interactions carry invisible goals. Validation. Reassurance. Security. These goals distort communication. The Stoics believe that desire corrupts clarity when it becomes attached to outcome. They did not advise eliminating desire. They advised detaching identity from it. When identity detaches from desire, loss becomes tolerable. And tolerance changes posture. A person who can tolerate loss does not cling. They do not rush to secure meaning. They allow events to unfold. I noticed that this tolerance often changed how others responded. Not because tolerance impressed them, but because it removed pressure. Pressure is exhausting. Most people do not realize how much of their attraction fatigue comes from carrying emotional weight that is not theirs. Stoicism removed that weight. Not by withdrawing, but by reclaiming responsibility. Your emotions are yours. Your stability is yours. No one else is assigned to maintain it. When this boundary is restored, relationships rebalance. Expectation dissolves. Choice returns. Choice is essential to desire. Without choice, attraction collapses into obligation. The Stoics believed that freedom was the most respectful state from which to engage another person. Anything less was coercion. I realized that many attempts to rekindle attraction fail because they attempt to control atmosphere instead of correcting posture. Posture is internal. It is how one stands when no response is guaranteed. When posture changes, behavior follows naturally, not strategically. Honestly. This honesty is felt immediately. It removes ambiguity. Ambiguity born from manipulation disappears. Only uncertainty remains. And uncertainty is not threatening. When the self is stable. A stable person does not fear uncertainty. They live inside it. Without losing form. This is where attraction becomes possible again. Not because certainty is offered, but because strength is visible. Strength here is not confidence. It is composure. Stoicism trained this composure deliberately. Through reflection. Through restraint. Through acceptance of what could not be controlled. I saw that when people developed this composure, they stopped chasing resolution. They no longer needed closure to move forward. They could continue. Without answers. This ability is rare. And rarity attracts. Attraction does not follow effort. It follows self-command. When self-command is restored, the dynamic no longer revolves around outcome. It revolves around presence. Presence does not ask. It allows. And when allowance replaces pressure, desire finds space again. Not guaranteed. Not forced. But possible. That possibility is the only honest foundation for attraction. There is a moment when a person realizes that they are no longer trying to be understood. This realization is quiet. It does not feel like victory. It feels like release. Stoic philosophy considered this moment essential. They believed that the need to be understood was a subtle form of dependence. A person who requires understanding places their inner state in another's hands. I noticed how often attraction weakens when someone explains themselves too much, clarifying intentions, justifying actions, correcting interpretations. All of this communicates one thing. I need you to see me a certain way. This need is heavy, even when expressed politely. The Stoics believed that a person should live in a way that required minimal explanation. Not because they were secretive, but because their actions were coherent. Coherence explains itself. When someone stops trying to manage perception, their behavior changes subtly. They speak less. They listen more. They allow misunderstanding without panic. This tolerance is often misunderstood. It is not indifference. It is confidence in one's own alignment. I observed that attraction often returns when a person stops correcting the narrative. They no longer chase agreement. They let others arrive at their own conclusions. This creates space. Space allows curiosity. Curiosity invites movement. Stoicism taught that clarity must come from within. If clarity requires constant external confirmation, it is fragile. A person who trusts their own judgment does not need to persuade others of it. They simply act. I noticed that when people reached this stage, their emotional reactions slowed. They were no longer triggered by small shifts. Tone changes. Delayed replies. Ambiguous signals. These no longer demanded immediate response. This calm is rare. And rarity attracts. The Stoics believed that tranquility was not the absence of emotion, but the absence of inner conflict. When inner conflict resolves, behavior becomes stable. Stable behavior removes confusion. Others no longer feel pulled or pushed. They feel free. Freedom is attractive. Not because it promises connection, but because it removes pressure. I realize that attraction often fades. When someone tries to secure certainty, they want to know where they stand. They want reassurance. They want definition. But definition too early collapses possibility. The Stoics accepted uncertainty as natural. They did not rush to define relationships. They allowed form to emerge over time. This patience created depth. Depth cannot be rushed. I noticed that when people stopped demanding clarity, clarity often arrived on its own. Not always in the form they expected. But honestly. Honesty is the foundation of real attraction. Not honesty of words, but honesty of posture. Posture is revealed in how a person handles not knowing. Do they panic? Do they pressure? Do they withdraw? Or do they remain steady? Steadiness communicates self-trust. Self-trust invites respect. Respect supports attraction. The Stoics believed that respect was inseparable from attraction. Without respect, desire becomes unstable. I observed that once self-trust was restored, outcomes lost their power. Whether someone stayed or left no longer defined worth. This freedom transformed interaction. There was no longer anything to prove. When nothing needs to be proven, presence becomes natural. And natural presence is compelling. Attraction does not seek perfection. It seeks authenticity without need. This authenticity emerges when explanation ends. When performance ends. When the self is no longer adjusted to fit expectation. Stoicism aimed to restore this state. Not to guarantee connection, but to protect dignity. And dignity, once reclaimed, changes everything. Not because others are controlled, but because the self is no longer compromised. This is where attraction either returns or dissolves cleanly. Both outcomes are honest. And honesty, even when it leads to separation, is preferable to attraction built on distortion. This is the quiet strength the Stoics valued. Not triumph, but alignment. When alignment is present, nothing essential is lost. When it is absent, no outcome can compensate. This is why the work always returns inward. At this stage, something becomes clear. Attraction is not restored by doing more. It is restored by removing distortion. Distortion comes from inner conflict. From wanting one thing and acting against it. From feeling one truth and presenting another. Stoic philosophy treated distortion as the enemy of integrity. Not because it was immoral, but because it fractured the self. A fractured self cannot hold presence. I noticed that when people tried to maintain attraction, while ignoring their own internal signals, their behavior became inconsistent. They would advance one moment and retreat the next. They would express desire and then deny it. This inconsistency eroded trust. Trust is not built through reassurance. It is built through predictability of character. The Stoics understood this deeply. They believed that a person should be recognizable across circumstances. Not rigid, but consistent. When character is consistent, others relax. They no longer need to decode behavior. Decoding is exhausting. I realize that attraction often fades. Because someone becomes difficult to read. Not mysterious. But incoherent. Their actions do not align with their tone. Their words do not align with their timing. This creates uncertainty without grounding. Stoicism aimed to eliminate this. They taught that action should follow judgment. Not emotion alone. Emotion passes. Judgment remains. When judgment leads, behavior stabilizes. Stability communicates reliability. Reliability creates safety. And safety allows attraction to deepen. Modern culture often undervalues safety. It chases intensity instead. But intensity without safety burns quickly. The Stoics preferred endurance. I observed that when people reclaimed internal alignment, their communication simplified. They stopped sending mixed signals. They stopped hedging. They stopped overcorrecting. They became clear by being whole. This wholeness was not loud. It was quiet. But it was felt immediately. Attraction does not require excitement. It requires orientation. A sense that the other person knows where they stand. The Stoics believed that confusion was a sign of inner disorder. If others were confused by you, it meant you were confused by yourself. This was not judgment. It was diagnosis. Once confusion ended internally, external confusion dissolved. People responded differently. Not because they were manipulated, but because interaction became clean. Clean interaction has no hidden agenda. No emotional debt. No unspoken demand. I noticed that when interaction reached this point, outcomes became secondary. Connection, if it continued, felt voluntary. Separation, if it occurred, felt complete. Nothing lingered unresolved. This completion mattered. Incomplete endings create longing. Complete endings create peace. Peace allows movement forward. Stoicism valued completion over clinging. They believed that unfinished emotional business was a sign of attachment. Attachment clouds judgment. I realized that attraction that returns after alignment is different from attraction driven by fear. It feels calmer, slower, more deliberate. It is not urgent. It does not demand constant proof. It exists without pressure. This kind of attraction is sustainable. Because it is built on integrity, not effort. The Stoics believed that any connection that required self-violation was not worth maintaining. They would rather endure loss than preserve distortion. This perspective changes how one relates to outcomes. You stop trying to hold things together at the cost of yourself. You allow truth to organize the result. Truth may lead to reunion or to separation, but it never leads to regret. Regret comes from self-abandonment, not from loss. When self-abandonment ends, whatever happens next can be accepted. Not emotionally numb, but internally stable. This stability transforms how attraction is experienced. It no longer feels like validation. It feels like resonance. Resonance does not need to be chased. It either exists or it does not. Stoicism teaches that dignity lies in remaining aligned regardless. When dignity is preserved, nothing essential is lost. This is the quiet threshold. Beyond it, attraction is no longer feared. It becomes simply one expression of a life lived without distortion. When that happens, even absence no longer threatens identity. And when absence loses its power, presence gains meaning. This is where the architecture holds. At the end of this process, something unexpected happens. Attraction stops being the focus. Not because it is rejected, but because it no longer defines anything essential. Stoic philosophy always aimed at this point. They believed that the highest form of freedom was indifference to outcomes, without indifference to life. This balance was rare and powerful. I noticed that when people reached this state, they no longer asked what would happen next. They were no longer scanning the future for confirmation. They lived inside what was already solid. This solidity is difficult to describe. It is not excitement. It is not confidence. It is grounded continuity. A sense that life is coherent, regardless of response. Attraction, when it appears here, feels different. It is not something to secure. It is something to allow. The Stoics believed that anything worth keeping must be able to leave. If something could not leave, it was already a burden. This belief reshapes relationships completely. Connection becomes voluntary. Presence becomes a choice. And choice restores dignity to both sides. I observed that when people stopped fearing loss, their interactions softened. They were no longer guarded. But they were no longer exposed. They stood comfortably inside themselves. This comfort is rare. Most people oscillate between defense and pursuit. The Stoics sought a third position: stillness. Stillness does not mean inactivity. It means absence of inner noise. When inner noise quiets, attention returns to the present moment. In this state, attraction no longer feels urgent. It feels calm. Not dull. Stable. Stability is deeply attractive to those who recognize it, and invisible to those who do not. The Stoics accepted this. They did not seek universal appeal. They sought alignment. Alignment changes what you tolerate. You no longer accept confusion in the name of connection. You no longer explain yourself endlessly to maintain interest. You allow people to meet you where you actually are. Some will not. And that is no longer threatening. I realized that this was the true outcome of the work. Not reunion. Not distance. But freedom from inner bargaining. Once bargaining ends, life becomes simpler. Decisions require less justification. Silence becomes neutral. Waiting becomes easy. Attraction, if it appears cleanly. Without leverage. Without debt. Without fear. This is the kind of attraction that can last, because it does not consume the self. The Stoics believed that the goal of philosophy was not happiness, but clarity. Clarity allows a person to live without distortion. When distortion ends, relationships become honest. Not always comfortable, but real. Real connection does not need maintenance. It needs presence. Presence emerges when the self is no longer compromised. When nothing is performed. When nothing is withheld. At this point, even absence feels acceptable. Because identity is no longer tied to being chosen. Being chosen becomes an addition, not a requirement. This is where attraction returns to its proper place. Not as validation, but as resonance. Resonance cannot be forced. It is either there or it is not. And when it is there, it does not need explanation. Stoicism teaches that a life lived this way is already complete. Anything that joins it does so freely. This is the quiet end. Not because nothing happens next, but because nothing essential depends on what happens next. Attraction is no longer pursued. It is permitted. And permission, given without need, is the strongest position there is. This is the architecture that holds.